It's March 1922, and in China, tensions are building between the two most powerful warlords in the country. The resulting war will be just one of many in a swirling kaleidoscope of shifting alliances, betrayal, and battle. The chaos culminates in 1928 as Chiang Kai-shek leads the northern expedition to crush the Manchurian warlords once and for all. But his tense alliance with the Communist Party, Soviet and Japanese intervention, all mean that China's turbulent warlord era will not end quietly. Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander, and welcome to The Great War. By 1916, China had entered a chaotic and violent warlord period that would last a dozen bloody years. The fragile republic established in 1912 all but collapsed after just a few years, and regional military governors backed by private armies competed for power, influence, and weapons. The toothless central government in Beijing served at the whim of whichever general happened to hold the city. Over time, warlords grouped together into shifting alliances known as cliques. By 1920, there were four major cliques. The Anhui, Zhili, and Fangtian cliques dominated central and northern China, while the south was mostly controlled by a separate canton government led by Republican revolutionary Sun Yat-sen. In 1920, the Zhili and Fangtian cliques destroyed the Anhui clique in the Zhili-Anhui War. But as so often in 1920s China, it was an alliance based on a common enemy. In 1922, the first Fangtian-Zhili War broke out, which began a cascade of violence that would last, in this form at least, until 1928. In 1922, the powerful Fangtian clique was led by Chang Zuolin, also known as the Tiger of the North. Accounts of his early life vary, but most agree he originally ran with bandit gangs in Manchuria. During the Russo-Japanese War, he worked for the Japanese, then supported him when he became a warlord. By 1916, he was refusing orders from the weak government in Beijing and essentially running Manchuria as his personal fiefdom. Victory in the 1920 Anhui-Zhili War benefited Chang greatly, even though his forces didn't do much actual fighting. He gained extensive new territory in Inner Mongolia and northern Zhili, as well as stores of weaponry. He also developed Manchuria's economy by building up industry and arsenals. By 1920, 71% of his income was going to the Fangtian army, and in 1922, he had about 100,000 troops under arms. The quality and loyalty of his men varied, but compared to other warlord armies, Fangtian forces were fairly well equipped, trained, and modern. This was due largely to Japanese support. The Japanese had big plans for Manchuria, and they hoped that Chiang could help achieve them. But Chiang himself had bigger aspirations, and he began to exert more influence over the weak central government in Beijing, which started rumors in the rest of the country that the government was nothing more than Fangtian puppets. All this worried Wu Peifu, the military leader of the Zhili clique and mastermind of the victory against Anhui. He felt that Chiang's growing power and prestige hadn't been earned. So after fighting together in 1920, by 1922 the Fangtian and Zhili cliques had grown suspicious of each other, and their leaders actually began to denounce each other in public. Chiang's Japanese support gave him a military edge, but gave Wu political ammunition to accuse him of being a foreign stooge. Japan, of course, was not the only foreign power that got involved in China's warlord disputes. Foreign business and military influence in China was centered on ports and major cities in which Western powers had forced the Chinese to grant them concessions. Britain, France, and Italy all provided occasional support to local warlords, but Japan and the Soviet Union became the most important foreign players in 1920s China. Generally speaking, foreign support was not about ideology, but about power politics. Japan supported Fangtian in 1922, but had previously offered to help Anhui and also offered Zhili assistance. Zhili refused, though, because they were working with the Italians. So Japan chose Chiang as its ally in Manchuria. Officially, Tokyo had a policy of non-intervention, But in practice, the Japanese army provided Fangtian arms, military advisors, and intelligence. The relationship, though, was rocky. Chiang depended on Japanese support to bolster his army, but Japan didn't support his more ambitious goals for national prominence. They wanted him to just stay in Manchuria and help them extend their influence there. Japanese Consul General in Mukden, Uchiyama Kiyoshi, felt that anything beyond this was bad for Japan. If Chiang becomes too strong, he might no longer rely on our support. Following the Russian Civil War, Soviet Russia also began to extend their influence into China. Emissaries like Mikhail Baradin contacted Chinese revolutionary nationalist groups, including Sun Yat-sen's Canton regime. Sun Yat-sen was eager for arms and expertise, so he accepted Soviet help, which caused Japan and other foreign powers to worry about Bolshevik feelings in China. Foreign powers also influenced events in China more indirectly. All states officially forbid gun running, but many European arms dealers made a fortune selling surplus equipment to warlords following demobilization after the Great War. European mercenaries were also a common sight in China, and Fangtian General Zhang Zongchang, the so-called dog meat general, regularly employed white Russian mercenaries, including 3,000 white guards and a Cossack bodyguard unit. Other foreign adventurers also made names for themselves in the turbulent world of warlord politics. Sun Yat-sen's bodyguards included Abraham Two Guns Cohen, a Polish-born British-Canadian with a penchant for dual-wielding revolvers, while Frank One-Armed Sutton was an Englishman who oversaw Chiang's Mukden arsenal and produced copies of the British Stokes mortar. So by April 1922, tensions between the Japanese-backed Fangtian clique and the Italian-backed Zhili clique were high. Chiang felt that he had the military edge and used his influence to install a prime minister of his choice in Beijing. Wu accused both of being Japanese imperialists, and so the First Fangtian-Zhili War broke out. Zhang Zuolin had already been preparing for the conflict with Wu for some time. He'd increased his forces to 120,000 men, 150 field guns, and 200 machine guns, numbers that few other Chinese armies could match. On paper, Zhili had 250,000 men after they absorbed the defeated Anhui forces, but in reality, they had barely 100,000 troops, 100 guns, and 100 machine guns. In March, the Fangtian clique made an agreement with Sun Yat-sen to attack Zhili from both the north and the south. Remnants of the Anhui clique, Fangtian's former enemies, would also join in for the kill. Historian Edward Dreyer described the unusual coalition this way. The alliance was surely as strange an assortment of bedfellows as any nation's politics has ever produced. Fangtian moved its forces south in late April, but Chiang's Grand Alliance lost one member as Sun Yat-sen's troubles in the south prevented him from joining in. Major clashes occurred near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, and as was common in Chinese warlord conflicts, fighting raged up and down the north-south railway lines. The struggle lasted several days until the forces of Zhili warlord Fang Yuxiang, also known as the Christian warlord, outflanked Chiang on May 4th. Panic spread amongst the Fangtian ranks, and they fled back to the Shanhai Pass, while Wu occupied Beijing. After barely a week of fighting, the First Zhili-Fangtian War was over. 3,000 soldiers had been killed and 7,000 wounded. Despite his victory, Wu was unable to pursue Chiang into Manchuria. Chiang declared his 3 provinces independent from Beijing and began a series of extensive reforms. He created a general headquarters and replaced his bandit leaders with Japanese-trained Chinese officers. By late 1923, he claimed to have 200,000 combat-ready troops. The Zhili clique had emerged victorious from the war against Fangtian, and it now dominated Beijing politics. But success did not bring stability. The Zhili clique began to suffer from internal power struggles. The faction's political leader, Cao Kun, bribed his way into the presidency, but competed for influence with Wu Peifu. Meanwhile, high-ranking officer Fang Yuxiang started to resent Wu's restricted leadership and control of the clique's finances. These tensions came to a head in the next war, which wasn't long in coming. Despite becoming the most powerful faction in China, the Zhili clique was surrounded by enemies. In mid-1924, Wu planned to unite much of China in a decisive military campaign. In September, fighting broke out between Zhili forces and the remaining Anhui warlords around Shanghai. The Anhui clique called for assistance, and Zhang Zuolin, eager to avenge his defeat against Zhili, accepted. The Second Zhili-Fangtian War was on. Wu, however, had planned for war on multiple fronts. He divided his 250,000 men into 3 armies. One of them was to march into Manchuria through the Shanhai Pass, a narrow passage through the Great Wall. Zhang concentrated his troops on the shortened front and brought the Zhili advance to a standstill in October. Wu then realized he could strike at Zhang from behind, so he ordered Fang to attack Zhang in the west. But the Christian warlord delayed. In fact, he was having second thoughts about helping Wu at all. For some time, he had been distancing himself from Zhili by introducing progressive reforms and Christian doctrines in the provinces under his control. If Fang helped Wu now, his rival would only get stronger. When the Japanese offered him a bribe of 1,500,000 yen, Fang made his choice. On October 23, 1924, he pulled back his forces from the front and sent them to Beijing to arrest President Cao Kun. Wu's position against the Fangtian-Anhui alliance was compromised, and he had no choice but to retreat and leave much of his weapons and equipment behind. He escaped to his stronghold in Henan-Hubei province, but as a political force, the Zhili clique was destroyed. The month-long war was the most significant so far in the warlord period. There were 20,000 to 30,000 casualties, and European observers noted that although the fighting was still quite mobile, it also showed some of the hallmarks of intense warfare with industrial weapons. As Zhang and Feng dished out the spoils of war and redistributed the Zhili provinces, the Soviet Union now began to pay attention to the Christian warlord on their border. Despite their socialist atheism, they saw Fang as a useful tool against the seemingly pro-Japanese Zhang. Moscow sent support and weapons, which allowed Fang to become a full-fledged warlord and create his own faction, the Kuomintang. Soviet involvement with Fang weakened his ties with Zhang, who began to fear a Soviet attack. When labor groups began to agitate on Zhang's territory, he sent in the dog-meat general to crush them. By October 1925, the Kuomintang and Fangtian cliques were locked in indecisive armed conflict. For Chinese civilians, the situation of constant war, weak governments, and marauding armies was becoming intolerable. Many saw Zhang as an illegitimate ruler, while Fang's betrayal had earned him a new nickname, the traitorous general. Public attitude was turning decisively against the warlord system, as the Guowen Weekly newspaper reported in May 1925. If Zhang and Fang can abandon military buildup and concentrate on civilian endeavors, in a few years, the result will be apparent and they may win the approval of the people and become national leaders. If they act impetuously by intervening in politics, all they can get is public condemnation. So Fang and Zhang had defeated Wu before fear and Soviet involvement helped push them apart. Meanwhile, in the south, former President Sun Yat-sen hoped to use anti-warlord public feelings to unite the fractured country. In 1919, Sun re-established the nationalist Kuomintang party in the French Shanghai concession, and by the early 1920s, he positioned the KMT as a viable alternative to the warlord system. But as with many things in warlord China, the reality was somewhat more complex. Sun Yat-sen felt only military victory over the northern warlords could revive the republic that he had created in 1912. He consistently called for a northern expedition to expel the warlords, and he sought international recognition. Neither of these efforts bore fruit. Militarily speaking, the southern provinces were outnumbered and outgunned. In 1924, the KMT's National Revolutionary Army had only 65,000 rifles for its 100,000 men, and 20% of these were obsolete. There were even a few matchlocks. The KMT also relied on the military support of neighboring warlords from the Yunnan and Guangxi cliques, who were less keen to risk their positions. A Chinese newspaper reported on the gap between intent and ability. The KMT's two main agendas are anti-imperialism and anti-warlordism. These two goals are indeed popular demands of the nation. One should certainly praise the KMT's ability to follow the trend. However, these two agendas are devoid of substance. Sun Yat-sen's solution to these problems was to develop the one thing the northern warlords lacked, an ideology. By instilling his forces with nationalist revolutionary fervor, he hoped any northern expedition would win hearts and minds and become an unstoppable force. To achieve this, he established a military academy to train a new breed of revolutionary officers less susceptible to the betrayal so common in warlord conflicts. He also asked for international support, and when the US and Japan showed no interest, Soviet Russia stepped in. The KMT had been drifting closer to communist thinking, partly because of agitation from the Young Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. Anti-Western and anti-Japanese sentiment had been increasing in Canton, while the First World War seemed to show the weakness of formerly revered Western culture. CCP co-founder Chen Duxiu didn't mince his words. In the West, men are lazy and profit-seeking, while women are extravagant and licentious. Wars, strikes, and all sorts of lamentable unrest, which of these is not caused by the moral decay of the system of private property? In exchange for Soviet advisors and arms, the KMT and CCP cooperated in an uneasy united front, in which they remained separate organizations. By the time of Sun Yat-sen's death in March 1925, distinct right and left-wing factions were developing in Canton. Sun was succeeded as KMT leader by the head of the military academy, Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang, with Soviet encouragement, renewed the call for a northern expedition within the party. Our army keeps alive the will of the late Generalissimo Sun and hopes to carry out his revolutionary proposals. To protect the welfare of the people, we must overthrow all warlords and wipe out reactionary power so that we may complete the national revolution. So by July 1926, Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang movement was now ready to launch a campaign against the northern warlords. But the Fangtian clique was stronger than ever after defeating the Kuomintang. The KMT's northern expedition launched on July 1st, 1926, and it was a military gamble given the strength of Fangtian and the fact that Beijing was 2,000 kilometers away. Chiang planned to use his National Revolutionary Army, or NRA, against one warlord at a time, to avoid provoking too much resistance at once. His first target was Wu Peifu's forces in Henan and Hubei provinces. Speed was key for the NRA. Wu's army was facing north against Kuomintang, but his ally Sun Quanfang was a threat from Jiangsu province. Chiang hoped to capture Wu's capital city of Wuhan before either could react. And the first clashes favored the NRA. Many of Wu's outnumbered and poorly motivated troops defected, and the NRA moved north along the railway. Wu managed to get units into positions south of Wuhan in August, but his counterattacks were broken up by NRA artillery. These attacks compromised Wu's defensive positions, and the NRA forced him north across the Yangtze River. Parts of Wuhan resisted the NRA for another month, but Chiang became master of the city. Wu was desperate and begged his ally Sun Quanfang for help. But Sun's troops only began to move in late August, a delay which allowed the NRA to reorganize and prepare. Chiang actually launched his attack first, but Sun recovered and fighting raged back and forth across Jiangsu province, and the capital of Nanchang changed hands several times. Both sides threw their best units into the fight, and losses were particularly heavy. The NRA may have lost 20,000 men just in the initial stages, and Sun 40,000. Many of Chiang's new officers from the academy had now been killed. But just as it seemed that exhaustion and stalemate were about to set in, another defection swayed the balance. The local government of Zhejiang province rose up against Sun and pledged its support to the northern expedition. Sun quickly crushed the uprising, but the diversion of troops allowed the NRA to push him across the Yangtze and take Nanchang and Fujian. Wu was now isolated and had lost most of his territory, so Sun was forced to ask the Fengtian clique for assistance. Sun was sober about his defeat. The people do not necessarily love the KMT, but they surely hate us. In December 1926, Chiang Zuolin announced the creation of the National Pacification Army. The army rallied other warlords to come together to resist the so-called Red Disease coming from the south. But for Sun, all this came too late, and in February 1927, the NRA moved on Shanghai and Nanjing. Both these cities had large foreign communities, and now the world powers took notice of the conflict. The Japanese, British, and Americans sent troops to protect their citizens and their interests. Among the Americans was famous Marine Smedley Butler. When the NRA marched into both cities in March, Chiang tried to reassure his new foreign neighbors. The purpose of the military operations of the Northern Expedition is to establish a nation governed by the people and to get rid of the warlords. The Party Army's success is the victory of the people. In accordance with international morality, we shall guard the lives and property of foreigners. We request that consuls inform your nationals to carry on your activities as usual and order the Marines not to misunderstand our motives and not to carry out means to obstruct our revolutionary cause. So by early 1927, Chiang Kai-shek's National Revolutionary Army had gained some important victories in the Northern Expedition. But his united front with the communists now began to break down, threatening to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. After Wuhan had been taken by the NRA, the CCP and the left wing of the KMT began to use it as a base for worker agitation. The city was home to an anti-Chiang movement which accused the KMT leader of being a right-wing reactionary and bourgeois dictator. Accusations that seemed more substantial since Chiang had reduced the KMT's revolutionary rhetoric to attract warlord defections and calm British and Japanese fears. Communist activity in Wuhan and attacks against foreigners there, plus labor unrest back in Canton, now threatened to derail the entire Northern Expedition in spite of its military progress. The situation was no better for the KMT in the countryside, where long-suffering peasants flocked to the CCP for help against the landowners and the warlords, and the CCP grew to 50,000 members. The fragile alliance between the KMT and the CCP began to crumble, as communist Liu Qi-xun explained. We were then in a quandary. On the one hand, we had to fight against the feudal forces of local bullies and bad gentry and the bourgeoisie. On the other, we had to cooperate with the KMT, which represented them. We had to prevent workers and peasants from solving their problems by themselves. We told them to wait for orders from the headquarters of the KMT. But to wait was as endless as that for the waters of the Yellow River to become clear. In March 1927, the CCP nullified Chiang's authority over its units, and it wasn't long before attacks in the media and between rival labor unions began. From April 12th, Chiang oversaw a massive purge of CCC members in Shanghai, as KMT forces executed communist leaders. The CCP's Soviet advisors urged restraint and encouraged them to complete the Northern Expedition. But Sun Yat-sen's vision of uniting China was now largely two separate efforts, one KMT with its capital in Nanjing, and one communist based in Wuhan. The KMT-CCP split came at a difficult time for the Northern Expedition. It was losing momentum, and the National Pacification Army pushed it back to the Yangtze. Chiang and the communists managed to avoid a total break and turn their attention back to the warlords. For now. Communist and NRA forces renewed their attacks to the north, and both tried to convince northern warlord Fang Yuxiang to join them. In June 1927, Fang sided with Chiang, but Chiang was nonetheless able to capture Beijing and turned what was left of the powerless central government into a military dictatorship. Chiang also told the press that unlike Fang, he was not about to switch sides. I have my own principles, and I am not the type who keeps changing his allegiance. By July, Chiang Zuolin had used his heavy railway artillery to push south through Shandong province. To make matters worse for the KMT, communist uprisings in several cities tied up valuable troops behind the lines. To try to heal the split, Chiang resigned his command, but open fighting broke out between the KMT and CCP. The communists were forced to go underground, but with Chiang gone, the KMT's military situation was fragile. Sun tried a do-or-die offensive to retake the lost capital of Nanjing and pushed 40,000 troops across the Yangtze, but the National Pacification Army surrounded and destroyed them. In spring 1928, Chiang returned to the head of the KMT to lead a renewed northern expedition. The NRA's advances brought them dangerously close to Japanese-controlled Tsingtao. In response, the Japanese sent 4,000 troops to reinforce their small Kwangtung army in April and move their forces further inland. Even Chiang complained, since he now wanted to shake off his pro-Japanese reputation. But to many Chinese, he remained, quote, a Japanese running dog. On May 3rd, the first clashes between the NRA and the Japanese occurred in what became known as the Jinan Incident. The Japanese claimed the NRA soldiers had attacked Japanese civilians, and Major General Tatekawa Yoshiji made Tokyo's intentions clear. It is necessary for Japan to chastise the lawless Chinese soldiers in order to maintain Japan's national and military prestige. In the end, Japan's intervention was not militarily decisive, but it did weaken Chiang politically. Chiang ordered his forces to avoid conflict with the Japanese and continued his drive on Beijing, which Chiang abandoned without a fight on June 1st. Japan now turned on its former client, and Chiang was killed 2 days later when a Japanese bomb exploded under the train that was taking him back to Manchuria. NRA troops marched into the national capital on June 6th against very light resistance. The Japanese hoped to use Chiang's death to extend their influence over Manchuria and believed that his drug-addicted son and successor would be even more pliable than his father. But the younger Chiang suspected the Japanese were behind his father's death, so he rejected their offers and joined the KMT. On December 29, 1928, KMT troops hoisted their flag over the arsenal at Mukden. Chiang now ushered in the optimistic Nanjing or Golden Decade of the Republic of China. In reality, though, peace and unity in China was an illusion. Japan would soon turn to force to return to Manchuria, and communist guerrillas under a young leader named Mao Zedong were organizing. These three forces, spawned during the warlord era, would soon clash in a global war and revolution that changed the course of Chinese history. The Chinese warlord era is a fascinating topic and one of the most important periods for understanding Chinese history. It was important for us to cover it here on the channel, but it's also exactly the kind of topic that YouTube and its algorithm don't like. It's messy and it's violent. It's not the kind of viral content that advertisers like to put their products next to, and in turn, it's less attractive for YouTube to promote. This is why we built our own streaming platform together with other educational creators. Nebula is a place where you can watch smart videos that interest you rather than the algorithm, and that allows you to support creators directly. CuriosityStream, the sponsor of this video, agrees with this approach and put together a sweet deal. If you subscribe at curiositystream.com/thegreatwar, you get access to classic documentaries on CuriosityStream, or you can watch your favorite creators on Nebula, like our World War II series, Rhineland 45. That's curiositystream.com/thegreatwar, and you get 2 streaming platforms for less than $15 for an entire year. We'd like to thank Mark Newton and Brian Lee for their help with this episode. As usual, you can find all our sources for the episode in the video description. If you want to support our channel, you can support us on Patreon, and the links for that are in the description below as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War, a production of real-time history and the only YouTube history channel whose allegiance you can truly rely on. Or can you?